Hello everyone and welcome to Word of Mouth. For those of you who do not know, Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. My name is Andrew Foster and today I'll be reading two stories for you. I'll be reading The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant and I'll be reading Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. If you enjoyed today's readings and would like to watch the next program, Word of Mouth is broadcast on the first and third Thursdays of every month. It goes to the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library's Facebook page. That's at MCCPL Morgan. And later that day is usually posted to our YouTube page, which is the Montgomery City County Public Library. I believe that's all the announcements I have for today. So let's get started with our first story. The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. She was one of those pretty and charming girls, born as though fate had blundered over her into a family of artisans. She had no marriage portion, no expectations, no means of getting known, understood, loved, and wedded by a man of wealth and distinction, and she let herself be married off to a little clerk in the Ministry of Education. Her tastes were simple because she had never been able to afford any other, but she was as unhappy as though she had been married beneath her. For women have no caste or class, their beauty, grace, and charm serving them for birth or family. Their natural delicacy, their instinctive elegance, their nimbleness of wit are their only mark of rank and put the slum girl on a level with the highest lady of the land. She suffered endlessly, feeling herself born for every delicacy and luxury. She suffered from the poorness of her house, from its mean walls, worn chairs, and ugly curtains. All these things of which other women of her class would not even have been aware, tormented and insulted her. The sight of the little Breton girl who came to do the work in her little house aroused heartbroken regrets and hopeless dreams in her mind. She had imagined silent antechambers, heavy with oriental tapestries, lit by torches in lofty bronze sockets, with two tall footmen in knee breeches, sleeping in large armchairs overcome by the heavy warmth of the stove. She imagined vast saloons hung with antique silks, exquisite pieces of furniture supporting priceless ornaments, and small, charming, perfumed rooms, created just for little parties of intimate friends. Men who were famous and sought after, whose homage roused every other woman's envious longings. When she sat down for dinner at the round table covered with 3 days old cloth opposite her husband, who took the cover off the soup tureen, exclaimed delightedly, "Ah, Scotch broth, what could be better?" She imagined delicate meals gleaming silver, tapestries peopling the walls with folk of past age and strange birds in fairy forests. She imagined delicate food served in marvelous dishes, murmured gallantries, listened to with an inscrutable smile as one trifled with the rosy flesh of trout or wings of asparagus chicken. She had no clothes, no jewels, nothing. And these were the only things she loved. She felt that she was made for them. She had longed so eagerly to charm, to be desired, to be wildly attractive and sought after. She had a rich friend, an old school friend whom she refused to visit, because she suffered so keenly when she returned home. She would weep whole days with grief, regret, despair, and misery. One evening her husband came home with an exultant air, holding a large envelope in his hand. "Here's something for you," he said. Swiftly she tore the paper and drew out a printed card on which were the words, "The Minister of Education and Madame Rapinoe request the pleasure of the company of Monsieur and Madame Lojol at the Ministry on the evening of Monday, January the 18th. Instead of being delighted, as her husband hoped, she flung the invitation petulantly across the table, murmuring, "What do you want me to do with this?" "Why, darling, I thought you'd be pleased. You never go out, and this is a great occasion. I had tremendous trouble to get it. Everyone wants one. It is very select, and very few go to the clerks. You'll see all the really big people there." She looked at him out of furious eyes and said impatiently, "And what do you suppose I am to wear to such an affair?" He had not thought about it. He stammered, "Why, the dress you go to the theater in, it looks very nice to me." He stopped, stupefied and utterly at a loss when he saw his wife was beginning to cry. 2 large tears ran slowly down from the corners of her eyes towards the corners of her mouth. "What's the matter with you? What's the matter with you?" he faltered. But with a violent effort she overcame her grief and replied in a calm voice, wiping her wet cheeks. "Nothing, only I haven't a dress, and so I cannot go to this party. Give your invitation to some friend of yours whose wife will be turned out better than I shall." He was heartbroken. Look here, Matilda," he persisted. "What would be the cost of a suitable dress, which you could use on other occasions as well? Something very simple?" She thought for several seconds, reckoning up prices and also wondering for how large a sum she could ask without bringing upon herself an immediate refusal and an exclamation of horror from the careful-minded clerk. At last she replied with some hesitation. "I don't know exactly, but I think I could do it on 400 francs. He grew slightly pale, for that was exactly the amount he had been saving for a gun, intending to get a little shooting next summer on the plain of Nanterre, with some friends who went lark shooting there on Sundays. Nevertheless, he said, "Very well, I will give you 400 francs, but try to get a really nice dress with the money." The day of the party grew near, and Madame Logel seemed sad, uneasy, and anxious. Her dress was ready, however. One evening her husband said to her, "What's the matter with you? We've been very odd for the last 3 days." "I'm utterly miserable at not having any jewels, not a single stone to wear," she replied. "I shall look absolutely no one. I would almost rather not go to the party." "Wear flowers," he said. "They're very smart at this time of year. For 10 francs you could get 2 or 3 gorgeous roses." She was not convinced. "No, there's nothing so humiliating as looking poor in the middle of a lot of rich women." "How stupid you are!" exclaimed her husband. "Go and see Madame Forestier, and ask her to lend you some jewels. You know her quite well enough for that." She uttered a cry of delight. That's true, I never thought of it." Next day she went to see her friend and told her trouble. Madame Forestier went to her dressing table, took up a large box, and brought it to Madame Logel, opening it and said, "Choose, my dear." First she saw some bracelets, then a pearl necklace, then a Venetian cross in gold and gems of exquisite workmanship. She tried the effects of the jewels before the mirror, hesitating, unable to make up her mind to leave them, to give them up. She kept on asking, "Haven't you anything else?" "Yes, look for yourself. I don't know what you would like best." Suddenly she discovered in a black satin case a superb diamond necklace. Her heart began to beat covetously. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. She fastened it around her neck, upon her high dress, and remained in ecstasy at the sight of herself. Then, with hesitation, she asked in anguish, "Could you lend me this, just this alone?" "Yes, of course." She flung herself upon her friend's breast, embraced her frenziedly, and went away with her treasure. The day of the party arrived. Madame Logel was a success. She was the prettiest woman present, elegant, graceful, smiling, and quite above herself with happiness. All the men stared at her, inquired her name, and asked to be introduced to her. All the undersecretaries of state were eager to waltz with her. The minister noticed her. She danced madly, ecstatically, drunk with pleasure, with no thought for anything in the triumph of her beauty, in the pride of her success, in a cloud of happiness made up of this universal homage and admiration, of the desires she had aroused, of the completeness of a victory so dear to her feminine heart. She left about 4 o'clock in the morning. Since midnight her husband had been dozing in a little deserted room, in company with 3 other men whose wives were having a good time. He threw over her shoulders the garments which he had brought for them to go home in, modest, everyday clothes, whose poverty clashed with the beauty of the ball dress. She was conscious of this and was anxious to hurry away so that she should not be noticed by the other women putting on their costly furs. Logel restrained her. "Wait a little, you'll catch cold in the open. I'm going to fetch a cab." But she did not listen to him and rapidly descended the staircase. When they were out in the street, they could not find a cab. They began to look for one, shouting at the drivers whom they saw passing in the distance. They walked down towards the Seine, desperate and shivering. At last they found on the quay one of those old prowling night carriages, which are only to be seen in Paris after dark, as though they were ashamed of the shabbiness in the daylight. It brought them to the door of the Rue des Martyrs, and sadly they walked up to their own apartment. It was the end for her. As for him, he was thinking that he must be at the office at 10. She took off the garments in which she had wrapped her shoulders, so as to see herself in all her glory before the mirror. But suddenly she uttered a cry. The necklace was no longer around her neck. "What's the matter with you?" asked her husband, already half undressed. She turned towards him in the utmost distress. I've no longer got Madame Forrester's necklace." He stared with astonishment. "What? Impossible!" They searched in the folds of her dress, in the folds of the coat, in the pockets, everywhere. They could not find it. "Are you sure that you still had it on you when you came away from the hall?" "Yes, I touched it in the hall at the ministry." "But if you lost it in the street, we should have heard it fall." "Yes, probably we should, but... did you take the number of the cab?" "No, you didn't notice it, did you?" "No." They stared at one another, dumbfounded. At last, Lojo put on his clothes again. "I'll go over the ground we walked," he said, "and see if I can't find it." And he went out. She remained in her evening clothes, lacking strength to get into bed, huddled on a chair without volition or power of thought. Her husband returned about 7. He found nothing. He went to the police station, to the newspapers to offer a reward, to the cab companies everywhere that a ray of hope impelled him. She waited all day long in the same state of bewilderness at the fearful catastrophe. Lojo came home at night, his face lined and pale. He had discovered nothing. "You must write to your friend," he said, "and tell her that you've broken the clasp of her necklace, and you are getting it mended. That will give us time to look about us." She wrote at his dictation. By the end of the week, they had lost all hope. Lojo, who had aged 5 years, declared, "We must see about replacing the diamonds." Next day, they took the box which had held the necklace and went to the jeweler's, whose name was inside. He consulted his books. "It was not I who sold the necklace, madame. I must have merely applied the clasp." Then they went from jeweler to jeweler, searching for another necklace like the first, consulting their memories, both ill with remorse and anguish of mind. In a shop at the Palais Royal, they found a string of diamonds which seemed to them exactly like the one they were looking for. It was worth 40,000 francs. They were allowed to have it for 36,000. They begged the jeweler not to sell it for 3 days, and they arranged matters on the understanding that it would be taken back for 34,000 francs if the first were found by the end of February. Lojo possessed 18,000 francs left to him by his father. He intended to borrow the rest. He did borrow it, getting 1,000 from one man, 500 from another, 5 louis here, 3 louis there. He gave notes of hand, entering into ruinous agreements, did business with usurers and the whole tribe of moneylenders. He mortgaged the whole remaining years of his existence, risked his signature without even knowing if he could honor it, and appalled at the agonizing fate of the future, at the black misery about to fall upon him, at the prospect of every possible physical privation and moral torture, he went to get the new necklace and put down upon the jeweler's counter 36,000 francs. When Madame Lojo went back with the necklace to Madame Forrester, the latter said to her in a chilly voice, "You ought to have brought it back sooner. I might have needed it." She did not, as her friend had feared, open the case. If she had noticed the substitution, what would she have thought? What would she have said? Would she not have taken her for a thief? Madame Lojo came to know the ghastly life of abject poverty. From the very first, she played her part heroically. This fearful debt must be paid off. She would pay it. The servant was dismissed. They changed their flat and took up a garret under the roof. She came to know the heavy work of the house, the hateful duties of the kitchen. She washed the plates, wearing out her pink nails on the coarse pottery and the bottoms of pans. She washed the dirty linen, the shirts and dishclothes, and hung them out to dry on a string. Every morning she took the dustbin down into the street and carried up the water, stopping on each landing to get her breath. And, clad like a poor woman, she went to the fruiterer, the grocer, the butcher, with a basket on her arm, haggling, insulted, fighting for every wretched halfpenny of her money. Every month, notes had to be paid off. Others renewed, time gained. Her husband worked in the evenings at putting straight a merchant's accounts, and often at night he did copying at 2 halfpenny a page. And this life lasted for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, everything was paid off. Everything. The usurer's charges, the accumulation of superimposed interest. Madame Logel looked old now. She had become like all the other strong, hard, coarse women of poor households. Her hair was badly done, her skirts were awry, her hands were red. She spoke in a shrill voice, and the water sloped all over the floor when she scrubbed it. But sometimes when her husband was at the office, she sat down by the window and thought of that evening long ago, of the ball at which she had been so beautiful and so much admired. What would have happened if she had never lost those jewels? Who knows? Who knows? How strange life is, how fickle, how little is needed to ruin or to save. One Sunday, as she had gone for a walk along the Champs-Élysées to freshen herself after the labors of the week, she caught sight suddenly of a woman who was taking a child out for a walk. It was Madame Forster, still young, still beautiful, still attractive. Madame Logel was conscious of some emotion. Should she speak to her? Yes, certainly. And now that she had paid, she would tell her all. Why not? She went up to her. Good morning, Jean. The other did not recognize her and was surprised at being thus familiarly addressed by a poor woman. But, madame, she stammered, I don't know. You must be making a mistake. No. I am Mathilde Logel. Her friend uttered a cry. Oh, my poor Mathilde, how you have changed. Yes, I've had some hard times since I saw you last, and many sorrows, and all on your account. On my account? How was that? You remember the diamond necklace you lent me for the ball at the ministry? Yes. Well, I lost it. How could you? Why, you brought it back. I brought you another one just like it, and for the last 10 years we have been paying for it. You realize it wasn't easy for me. We had no money. Well, it's paid for at last, and I am glad indeed. Madame Forster had faltered. You say you bought a diamond necklace to replace mine? Yes, you hadn't noticed it? They were very much alike. She smiled in proud and innocent happiness. Madame Forster, deeply moved, took her two hands. Oh, my poor Mathilde, but mine was imitation. It was worth at the very most 500 francs. Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, Jr. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They were not only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not quite being springtime, and it was in that clammy month that the H.G. men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheek, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic like bandits from a burglar alarm. "That was a real pretty dance they just did," said Hazel. "Huh?" said George. "That dance, it was nice," said Hazel. "Yeah," said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good. No better than anyone else would have been, anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked, so that no one seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did two of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had asked George what the latest sound had been. It sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, he said. "I think it'd be real interesting hearing all the different sounds," said Hazel, a little envious. "All the things they think up." "Ah," said George. "Only, if I was the handicapper general, you know what I would do?" said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Clampers. "If I was Diana Moon Clampers," said Hazel, "I'd have chimes on Sunday, just chimes, kind of in honor of religion." "I could think if it was just chimes," said George. "Well, maybe make 'em real loud," said Hazel. "I think I'd make a good handicapper general." "Good as anybody else," said George. "Who knows better than I do what normal is?" said Hazel. "Right," said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that. "Boy," said Hazel, "that was a doozy, wasn't it?" It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor and were holding their temples. "All of a sudden you look so tired," said Hazel. "Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch?" She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. "Go on, rest the bag for a while," she said. "I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while." George weighed the bag with his hands. "I don't mind it," he said. "I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me." "You've been so tired lately, kind of wore out," said Hazel. "If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls. Just a few." 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out," said George. "I don't call that a bargain." "If you could just take a few out when you came home from work," said Hazel. "I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around." "If I tried to get away with it," said George, "then other people would get away with it too. And pretty soon we'd be back to the Dark Ages all again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you?" "I'd hate it," said Hazel. "There you are," said George. "The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society?" If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to the question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. "I reckon it'd all fall apart," said Hazel. "What would?" said George blankly. "Society?" said Hazel uncertainly. "Wasn't that what you just said?" "Who knows?" said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up and handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. "That's all right," Hazel said of the announcer. "He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard." "Ladies and gentlemen," said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was very unfair for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, and timely. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a crackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion for plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete. He is under-handicapped and should be regarded as extremely dangerous." A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen, upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and to cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, "do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him." There was a shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again, as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. "My God," said George, "that must be Harrison." The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor," cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everybody must do as I say at once." He stamped at his foot, and the studio shook. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened. I am a greater ruler than any man who has ever lived. Now, watch me become what I can become." Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bars of the padlock that secured his head harness. The bars snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man who would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. "I shall now select my empress," he said, looking down on the cowering people. "Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet claim her mate and her throne." A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. "Now," said Harrison, taking her hand, "shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance?" "Music!" he commanded. The musicians scrambled back to their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. "Play your best," he told them, "and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls." The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false. But Harrison snatched two musicians from their chairs and waved them about like batons as he sang the music he wanted. He slammed them back in their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weight to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gambled, and spun. They leapt like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. And they did. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in the air inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and the Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them that they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You been crying?" he said to Hazel. "Yeah," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forgot," she said. "Something really sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was the sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel, "I could tell that one was a doozy." The end. I hope everyone enjoyed our stories for today. Next time we are going to be in is going to be on October the 1st. Will be the next Thursday that we have this program. For that Thursday and for the month of October, we'll be doing a few stories by Edgar Allan Poe. I hope you join us then. Have a wonderful day.